Welcome to Cool Talk. Today we examine the life and times of the French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte and his times. Now, if you haven't seen my previous video of the French Revolution, it's a good idea to catch it first before coming over here. But let's begin. Napoleon was born on the island of Corsica, which was Genoese territory until the year he was born, when it was sold to the French to settle a debt. And Napoleon's original language was Corsican. His parents were Carlos and Leticia Bonaparte. Now, Napoleon said he got his self-discipline from the upbringing that he got from his mother. His father held many political posts, but he was careless and gambled too much. He left Corsica at a young age to go to France, and eventually started studying at the military academy Briand-le-Château, where he was bullied because of his Corsican accent and his quiet, brooding demeanor. When his father suddenly died, leaving his wife Leticia penniless and with 8 children, Napoleon was kind of in a bind. There wasn't much money, so he had to finish 2 years of military academy in one. Now, Napoleon had a very keen mind. He thought like a professional chess player, always several moves ahead. If presented with a problem, he could discern all the variables and come to a quick conclusion, make quick decisions, and this ability would serve him well in the future when he was at war. And he engineered many complex military tactics and kept track of all his troops and all his officers in different places at all times. Then came the French Revolution, where the French were slowly disposing of the monarchy. It was bloody, a revolution led by Maximilien Robespierre. Now, in 1793, Napoleon wrote a pamphlet supporting the new republic and catching the eye of Robespierre. And for his efforts, Napoleon was appointed artillery commander of the Revolutionary Army, and he was sent to the city of Toulon to squelch an uprising there. And like Alexander the Great, Napoleon led his own troops. He had a horse shot out from under him, and he got wounded in the thigh, but he prevailed, winning the battle, and for his efforts he was made Brigadier General. He was 24 years old. All over Europe, nations formed alliances, coalitions to deal with the French and its radical ideas. Now, the French suffered at first, but soon prevailed, and Napoleon did his part. He led his troops into northern Italy and Austria and the Holy Roman Empire, winning battle after battle after battle. And by October 1797, only Great Britain remained of the first coalition. This is Desiree Clary. Now, her sister was married to Napoleon's brother. Napoleon met Desiree and became infatuated, and soon they became engaged. A movie was made about this relationship in 1954, and yes, that is Gene Simmons and Marlon Brando. At any rate, Napoleon was to be wed, but suddenly he meets Josephine de Beauharnois, and he is smitten. He breaks off his engagement to Desiree and decides to marry Josephine. Josephine was 6 years older than Napoleon. She had 2 children. Her first marriage ended when her husband was executed by Robespierre, and Napoleon's family was shocked. Why would Napoleon marry a widow 6 years his senior and with 2 children? Well, marry her he did, and a few days later he went off to fight in Italy. He carried a small portrait of Josephine in his pocket. He would pull out the portrait several times a day and kiss it. His love letters to Josephine were very, very passionate, very ardent. Let me give you a sample. Josephine, I wake filled with thoughts of you. Your portrait and the intoxicating evening we spent yesterday have left my senses in turmoil. Sweet, incomparable Josephine, what a strange effect you have had on my heart. My soul aches with sorrow, and there can be no rest for your lover. You are leaving at noon. I shall see you in 3 hours. Until then, mio dolce amor, 1,000 kisses. But give me none in return, for they set my blood on fire. How romantic, and how sad that these feelings were not reciprocated. Josephine rarely wrote to Napoleon, and when she did, her letters were pretty dry. Now, just 1 year after her wedding to Napoleon, she began an affair with a young lieutenant named Hippolyte Charles. He was 21 years old. Now, when Napoleon heard the rumors, he went into a dark rage. But Josephine spoke to him. She assured him that the rumors were not true. So Napoleon said, okay. So he was unlucky in love, but in war, Napoleon had no equal. He was an expert in luring the enemy into unfavorable positions, pretend to retreat, then attack, use amazing speed and nobility, pursue an enemy relentlessly. One of his favorite maneuvers was called wheeling, where 3 flanks of his troops would swing simultaneously. Napoleon would conceal his forces, use an envelopment strategy, fight 2 fronts from the center, first left, then right, annihilate one, and then the other. He had no match. In Italy, he captured 150,000 prisoners, 540 cannons, and over $45 million in funds. Then Napoleon invaded Egypt. He wanted to try to cut off the British trade routes, and when he did, he brought along scientists, engineers, and scholars. He knew of the influence of the Egyptian heritage, and from these expeditions, a 23-volume description of Egypt was published, and more importantly, was a discovery of the Rosetta Stone, which would later be the key to breaking the Egyptian hieroglyphics that were the decisive factor in understanding ancient Egyptian history. So that was a great benefit to all mankind culturally. However, on land, Napoleon won many battles, but his troops were decimated by the bubonic plague, which killed thousands of his men. Then Napoleon had 14,000 prisoners killed by drowning, men, women, and children. To make matters worse, Sir Horatio Nelson of the Royal British Navy appeared, and he destroyed Napoleon's fleet. The army was trapped in Egypt. Now, Napoleon had learned by this point that he was wanted in France, so he left General Kepler in charge and left Egypt. In essence, he abandoned his troops. Yet he managed to suppress the information. Nobody knew about the disaster over there in Egypt. He received a hero's welcome in Europe, and he was encouraged by some to take over. And so, in 1799, Napoleon entered the Directory with his troops, and he forced the assembly to write a new constitution and form a consulate, with him as the lead counsel. He had become dictator of France. He was 30 years old. And as consul, Napoleon centralized the government, but more importantly, he created a new legal code, the Napoleonic Code. And this code was not based on old Rome or Greece. It was a practical, simple set of laws that treated all men equally. There were no exceptions due to rank or title. This equality was not based on moral grounds or religious grounds. Napoleon said it was practical, and the code is still used in many countries today. Belgium, Spain, Portugal, Netherlands, the German Empire. It would spread to the Middle East and others, even the United States. Now today we think of equality under the law as a given, but back then this was revolutionary. Now, Pope Pius VI had been against the French Revolution, so when Napoleon's troops invaded the Holy Roman Empire and Italy, the Pope was arrested, and as prisoner of France, he died in 1799. He was big on educating his people, opening many schools and establishing a university. He also opened the National Bank of France. But before all of this activity took place, while Napoleon was in Egypt, he learned that Josephine was still seeing this Hippolyte Charles. And this time he believed the rumors. He wrote a letter to his brother Joseph to begin divorce proceedings, but the letter was lost. Now Josephine, in the meantime, rushed to Napoleon and begged forgiveness. She said she would end the affair with Hippolyte Charles, and Napoleon said, okay. And as for Hippolyte Charles, he had made a lot of money through his adventures with Josephine. He invested wisely. He bought estates in Spain, a few castles, and would die years later a wealthy middle-aged man. So Napoleon kept Josephine by his side, and even though she apparently picked up no more lovers, trust had been broken. Respect was gone. Napoleon now began having several love affairs of his own. Now, when the Austrians had taken over Italy, Napoleon and his troops decided to pay a visit. Now, look at these mountains, the Alps. Can you imagine crossing this with a whole army? Well, this is exactly what Napoleon did, surprising the Austrians and kicking them out of Italy in a month. On the island of Hispaniola in the West Indies, on the French colony of Saint-Domingue, pardon my French, a slave revolt had become a revolution with a leader by the name of Toussaint Louverture. Now, Napoleon had sent out a General Leclerc to deal with the revolt. Now, Leclerc had brought along his wife Paulette, Napoleon's sister. Now, Paulette and Leclerc didn't love each other. It was kind of an open relationship, and he wanted to send her back to France, but she refused to go. Well, Leclerc did capture Toussaint, but then this little guy appeared, spreading disease and decimating the French troops. Paulette herself got sick, as did Leclerc. Now, she survived, but he didn't. Toussaint would die in a French prison, but he stated that the tree of liberty would rise again in Saint-Domingue, and so it did, and became the new nation of Haiti. Seeing not much future in colonizing the Americas, Napoleon decided to sell the French territory in the Americas to the United States. This was the Louisiana Purchase. He sold it for $15 million to Thomas Jefferson. This transaction doubled the size of the United States at that time. And if this had not happened, the U.S. would look very different today. Can you imagine today's continental U.S. into 3 different countries, 1 Spanish, 1 French, and 1 American? It's impossible to say what would have happened. Probably regions would have rebelled here and there. There could have been several nations, different borders. But since the United States is the remaining superpower today, the influence of the Louisiana Purchase cannot be overestimated. In France, a bomb exploded, killing dozens of people. It was discovered that it was intended for Napoleon and his family. Now, they got out okay, but Napoleon had the conspirators rounded up and executed. He also took advantage of this to exile 130 Jacobins, the radical revolutionaries of before, and had them exiled out of the country. He felt they were still a threat to his power. And speaking of power, Napoleon called for a new election in France, and overwhelmingly he was voted in to be emperor for life. The monarchy was back. The coronation took place on December 2nd, 1804. Napoleon and Josephine were crowned emperor and empress. Now, the weight of the capes and the chains, the jewelry and the robes caused them both to almost trip over. The Pope was there to crown them. Now, the story of Napoleon snatching the crown away from the Pope and crowning himself was not entirely true. This was planned. The crown weighed 18 pounds, so Napoleon wasn't snatching anything. He took the crown away from Pope Pius VII, and since he was already wearing a gold wreath on his head, he placed it over Josephine. Now, by then, another coalition of nations had been formed by the British, the Austrians, and the Russians. Now, Napoleon tried to bluff Britain into following his ships into the West Indies and away from Europe, but this didn't work. The British attacked Napoleon and beat him at the Battle of Trafalgar. Now, in the Battle of Austerlitz, Napoleon had his finest hour. He feigned retreat, pretended that his army was weak, and he lured in the Austrians. Then he rushed his troops forward, filled in the gaps, and defeated the Austrians. destroyed the Prussian army as well, capturing 140,000 troops and 2,000 cannons. By now, Napoleon had realized that Josephine would never be able to bear him children. So, desperate for a male heir, he told Josephine he wanted a divorce. Now, he allowed Josephine to keep the title of Empress, and he supported her for the rest of her life. And then he married Marie Louise, Duchess of Parma. She was 18, he was 41. On March 20, 1811, she gave birth to Napoleon Francois Joseph Charles Bonaparte, a boy. In Iberia, the territory of Spain and Portugal, the French subdued the enemy there. Napoleon took the kingdom of Spain and gave it to his brother Joseph. Now, this angered the Spanish, and guerrilla-like warfare would ensue. Yet, this constant warfare weakened the Spanish, and they lost their territories in the Americas as these nations rebelled against Spain and became independent. Then came the Treaty of Tilsit. On a raft in a neutral place, a peace treaty was signed between Russia and France. Napoleon and Tsar Alexander signed an agreement, and then later Alexander would agree to be part of Napoleon's continental plan. The plan was that no European nation would do trade with Britain. A relative calm had set in. But when Napoleon learned that Russia was planning to invade Poland and that it had broken the agreement and was selling goods to Britain, he decided to act. Now, his advisors told him it was not wise to engage two enemies on two different massive fronts, Spain and Russia. But Napoleon didn't listen. He would continue the war in Spain as he invaded Russia. And with 450,000 men, on June 24, 1812, the invasion of Russia began. As the French invaded, the Russians would fight and then retreat, burning their food supply as they went along, deeper and deeper into Russian territory. In the Battle of Borodino, 44,000 Russians and 35,000 French would die in battle in one day. And as the Russians went along, they continued to destroy their food supply. By November, the cold had set in, and at the Battle of Berezina, Napoleon needed to cross a river, but found all the bridges destroyed. Now, as the Russians bombarded the French, Napoleon frantically maneuvered his men this way and that until they could build pontoon bridges and get across. The water was freezing. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow, he found it in flames. Now, he stayed for 5 weeks to see if the Russians would negotiate surrender, but they didn't. Now, this made no sense to the French. Once you take a nation's capital, or a symbolic capital like Moscow was, you're supposed to surrender. You lost. But the Russians didn't. So Napoleon stayed, and his men tried desperately to put out the fire and find food. They found none. Napoleon realized the Russians were not going to surrender, and that the French themselves had lost. They had to retreat, and so began the long, freezing retreat into Poland. The snow was knee-deep. They had to cross the river at Berezina again, and all the while, the Russians were shooting and bombing them. 200,000 horses died, so they were mostly on foot. And without the horses, cannon and artillery had to be left behind. Soldiers lost limbs to frostbite and gangrene. There was barely enough dry wood to start any fires. When they passed by a village or a city, they could stay inside, but there were many holes from the bombardments, and they would fill the holes and the gaps with limbs and heads from the dead. Of the over 400,000 French troops that Napoleon left France with, an estimated 40,000 came back, possibly even less. Now, historians disagree on the numbers, but we can safely say that over 300,000 French were killed, over 300,000 Russian troops also died, and over 1 million civilians. Napoleon finally reached France, only to find that a coalition had been formed against the French. Prussia, Austria, and Britain knew that Napoleon was weak. And though Napoleon did manage to put together a few 100,000 men, there were few horses and little equipment. And so on March 1814, Napoleon had to surrender. He abdicated the throne and was sent to exile to live on the tiny island of Elba. His wife and son were sent to Austria, but his first wife, Josephine, had gotten sick and died. Napoleon was devastated. He locked himself up in a room for 2 days. Napoleon did manage to escape the island, form an army, and govern as emperor again, but only for 100 days. The people, the legislative branches, and many of the troops had turned against him. He ended up surrendering, and this time he was sent far away to the island of St. Helena, a small island 1,000 miles off the coast of Africa. This was his home, and this was his bed. He died 6 years later at the age of 51. His last words were, "France, my son, the army, Josephine." And so ended the age of Napoleon. France ended up with less territory than when he began, yet his influence remains enormous. Now for my next video, we're going to examine the independence in Latin America, especially the life of one man, Simón Bolívar. But until then, thanks for watching. Comment below, or better yet, subscribe. This is Cool Talk.